On the green fence. On the green fence.
Neil here, thanks for joining me. Now, I don't know about you, but personally, I've never really thought that much about allergies because I don't have any myself. But climate change is shifting the goalposts, and it's really worth sticking around, even if you are completely healthy, without any allergies yet. And the emphasis here is on yet. But first, let's bring in a couple of facts on allergies. An allergy is a chronic condition involving an abnormal reaction to an ordinarily harmless substance called an allergen. Allergens can include aeroallergens, such as mold and pollen, as well as food allergens, such as milk, wheat or nuts. Now, before the pandemic, the WHO described allergies as the biggest medical challenge. They are the most common chronic disease in Europe, already affecting almost 40% of the population, and scientists believe this figure could rise to 50% by 2050. Now, allergies, they rarely end up killing people, but they can make life very miserable, unbearable for some even. They can impact severely on our psyche and ability to work or do anything meaningful, really. What's more, they can start at a very early age and stay with you your whole life, and all this is costing our economies dearly, up to 150 billion euros annually in the EU alone. Now, one of the most common allergies is against pollen, and for this episode, I'm going to track down the most allergenic plant in the world, which is also spreading here in Germany after arriving from the US. But before I head into the field, let's bring in Professor Claudia Traidl-Hoffmann. She's the head of the Department of Environmental Medicine at the University of Augsburg, and she can explain how climate change is impacting on pollen and our health, and how this may even be relevant for viruses such as COVID.
In general, we have 4 effects of climate change on pollen. The first one is that the pollen season is longer. They are starting earlier in the year and they are flying longer in the year. So at the end, we have not really a season anymore, but we have the whole year where we have pollen in the air. The second is we have more pollen per day. Also, this is changing. And this is also something we see also in cities. The trees from urban areas, they're producing more pollen. And the third thing is due to pollution, they are getting more aggressive. And the fourth thing is that we have new allergens. We have, for example, Ambrosia, which is a new plant which is inducing asthma attacks from the first time you are getting into contact with this pollen.
Pollen, this was also news to me. There was a connection that you outlined that it not only makes us more susceptible to viruses, but that there might also be a correlation to a spike in COVID cases. Can you perhaps explain a bit more on that?
This is really intriguing. So when I started working on pollen, I was seeing that pollen are changing the immune system in a way that they are blocking the immune system, the mucosal surface. And this was something I was already seeing almost 15 years ago, but we were not really sure how this was working. And now, today, we really know the molecular mechanisms, what is happening. So the pollen is landing on the mucosal surface, not only of allergics, but also of everyone, and is blocking here specifically type 1 interferons. So these are mediators that our immune system of the mucosa needs or takes for fighting against viruses. So we have our own, let's say, soldiers against viruses. And these soldiers, they are blocked by pollen. And what we saw then is when we did really a big study over 5 continents in the early 2020, when COVID was coming over the world, we saw that we had a correlation of pollen counts and infection numbers. And this was correlated with really high pollen numbers that were 2,000 pollen per cubic meter. And this is something we are seeing only in spring. And there was a clear correlation, means that pollen are making us more susceptible for infection with SARS-CoV-2, but with all rhinoviruses at the end. And this is also something we have to take into account, and then also to tell vulnerable people that during high pollen count, they should really wear a mask when they're going outside and the pollen are flying.
Okay. Well, I might just pack one just in case, because I will be going ambrosia hunting with a botanist.
Yeah, absolutely. And with gloves and mask, because they are doing also contact dermatitis. So please wear mask and gloves.
It's amazing somehow. You know, I never thought that in Germany, it always seems like such a safe environment that there is actually a plant that is a real health hazard, ambrosia or ragweed.
Yeah. It's incredible. So when you look at these pollen under the microscope, they seem a little bit like a coronavirus, actually, with these spikes on the surface, and it's because they are smaller. The pollen are smaller than birch pollen, for example, and this is why they are getting also deeper in your lungs. And they are doing really strong asthma attacks, and people are suffering like hell from this ambrosia.
Now, after talking to Professor Traidl-Hoffmann there, I packed my bag for a 2-hour drive south along the Rhine to meet up with a botanist called Johannes Mazomeit. He works for the Environmental Conservation Society Pollichia, which was founded in 1840, and one of his tasks is to find and eradicate ambrosia, or ragweed, populations in the state of Rhineland-Palatinate in southwestern Germany. And he opened my eyes to this highly problematic and inconspicuous plant that is spreading across Europe and triggering more and more allergies. I was told this plant is so allergenic I really shouldn't even touch it. This is a huge field. Is it okay for me to walk in here? Is it safe?
Im Moment ist es unproblematisch, weil...
Right now, it's not a problem because they are not carrying any pollen. Pollen is only produced when the plant blooms, which is usually in midsummer. But then it can actually bloom for a long time until the first frost. And that is a big problem because this means that people who are allergic to pollen have a prolonged period of suffering.
Eine verlängerte Leidenszeit haben.
Okay, just so you can picture where I'm standing right now. I'm on the outskirts of a town called Weisenheim im Sand. It's just west of Ludwigshafen. Ludwigshafen you might know because it's very famous for one of the world's biggest chemical companies. BASF has its headquarters there. And this is a field. It's probably about, it's almost it's definitely a soccer pitch. And it's a field that's quite large and it's just filled. These are all ambrosia plants, right? This is a health hazard.
Ja, man fragt sich, wie kommt die Ambrosia hierher überhaupt, ja?
Yes, without a doubt. But the real question is, how did it get here in the first place? We know that ragweed was brought here from North America through grain deliveries in the 19th century. We also know that ragweed seeds are found in the bird feed that people put in their gardens to help birds get through the winter. But what's really surprising is that we have ragweed in the middle of the forest here in Rhineland-Palatinate. Eventually, we discovered that it got there because hunters were unwittingly using ragweed-infested animal feed to attract game. Ragweed also spreads fast in sandy soil, especially after the soil has been disturbed by animals or machines. That's because often the seeds are already deeper in the ground where they can last for decades. Once they are brought to the surface, they are activated. They just need the right temperatures to get started. Ragweed also seems to suppress other species, as you can see here in this field. It almost looks like a monoculture. There's nothing else growing here.
Man denkt, es wäre angesät, also weil das ist ja alles nur diese Art.
It looks like a wheat field, as if somebody's sown out wheat and it's just this plant. I mean, just to describe it as well, it's like this is about knee high. How high can it get? Is this the full height?
Die Pflanze ist sehr anpassungsfähig hinsichtlich ihrer Größe. Wir kennen Pflanzen an Straßenrändern.
The size can vary a lot. Plants on roadsides are sometimes just a few centimeters high. But if the soil is fertile and it can develop, they can grow 2 meters high.
2 Meter hoch werden.
Yeah, let me just pick one. Hang on. It's okay for me to touch it, right?
Yes.
Okay, I've pulled this one
Das
out
sind jetzt
by the...
vertrocknet.
Yeah.
Deshalb braucht man etwas Fantasie, aber man sieht
These here are all dried up now.
nicht.
But just look at this. Here you can see still that it's got a hairy stem. Look, it's like fine hairs protruding here. And here you can see the fruits towards the top of the plant. They have like small thorns that can get tangled in the fur of animals to help the plant spread. We're lucky that the fruits are comparatively heavy, which means that they are not spread by the wind, but usually fall to the ground near the plant. So they are comparatively stationary, and that's a blessing. Otherwise, we'd have no chance to control ragweed.
Sonst hätte man sowieso keine Chance, die Ambrosia zu bekämpfen.
So that means the seeds, they don't fly through the air. They're not carried through the air. They're quite heavy. They're only carried by animals, and they often drop off the animals because they're heavy. But the pollen, they're flying all over the place, right? Because I read that one plant can have up to 3 billion pollen grains. I mean, is that normal? That sounds absolutely off the wall for me. Are other plants like that as well, or is it just Ambrosia that has so many?
Pollen sind allgemein klein. Ich kann jetzt nicht für die einzelnen Arten Zahlen nennen, aber die Relevanz.
I can't give you numbers for the individual species, but the problem with ragweed pollen grains is that they are very small, and a small amount is enough to trigger allergic reactions even in people who never ever were allergic to anything until then. I myself have been lucky so far, but you never know.
Ich möchte es nicht beschreien, habe glücklicherweise noch nicht so Reaktionen.
That would have been my next question, because I mean, there's a stat: 15% of Germans are sensitized to ambrosia already. You're working with this. You're an ambrosia hunter. You've been tasked by the state government, the Environment Ministry of Rheinland-Pfalz, to track and find ambrosia. Any allergic reactions yet? Because you come really close to this plant, right? At all throughout the year.
Ja, man muss vorsichtig sein. Es gibt Menschen, das gilt für alle.
You really have to be careful. There are people who start showing allergic reactions to ragweed as late as 40 or 50. A colleague of mine, after years of working with this plant, suddenly developed a ragweed allergy and had to reduce his field work because of this. It can hit anybody. I also know a woman who runs a restaurant with a patch of sunflowers nearby that her father had planted. After picking some sunflowers from the field, she developed this terrible rash in her face. It was really bad, and her customers were horrified when they saw her. It turned out that the sunflower patch was infested with ragweed. Often, cheap sunflower seed packages can contain ragweed seeds similar to bird or animal feed.
Blumenanbauflächen auch ein Einschleppungsort.
I'm probably just imagining this right now, but I've got the feeling my 2 fingers are itching that I touched the plant. But can we just move out of this field just a little bit? I'm a bit, I don't know, a bit suspicious of this plant. Johannes, just one question also, because I think for a lot of people, I don't know, I can't remember having seen this plant. It looks like a run-of-the-mill weed. Yeah, it could be. I mean, how difficult is it for people to recognize this plant for what it is?
Wenige haben sich tatsächlich nur mit der Ambrosia beschäftigt und können sie zwar.
It's not always easy. That's why we always ask people reporting them to send us pictures. And in many cases, it's not ragweed. It can be confused with other green weeds quite easily if you're not an expert. What makes it so difficult is that ragweed doesn't have any conspicuous blossom. That's because it doesn't have to attract insects for pollination. The wind takes care of this. So you may well walk past ragweed without recognizing it.
Unkraut anspricht, was ja nicht optisch groß ansprechend ist.
How does global warming tie into all this? What does this mean for the spread of ambrosia in Germany or in Europe?
Also es gibt auch in Rheinland-Pfalz diese Betrachtung. Es gibt in Rheinland-Pfalz ein Klimakompetenzzentrum, was
We have a climate competence center here in Rhineland-Palatinate that is monitoring this. But we have to be careful here. We can certainly say that warmer temperatures earlier in the year facilitate the germination of ragweed. Also, the longer the frost-free phase is, the longer it can bloom, and consequently produce more seeds. There has been a clear spread in this region in recent decades, but there are other factors aside from warmer temperatures that play a role here. First of all, ragweed is not a species that spreads primarily on its own. It has to be introduced to an area first, and this is usually done by humans or animals. Then another factor comes in, and this may sound surprising. Ragweed indeed benefits from the warmth, but it is also a cold germinator. In years where we hardly had any frost, we actually noticed a lower population. So this is way more complex. And the other factor, which I have also noticed in recent years, is that in the years when it was very dry, with hardly any rain, the ragweed also suffered. So you can't really say the warmer the better for ragweed.
Wo man sagen kann, je wärmer, desto besser.
Okay, so it's not as simple as some people might think, that climate change, global warming immediately means more ambrosia. There are other factors that tie into it. There was one other thing that I thought was really interesting, and that also impacts on ambrosia. I read about rising CO2 levels in the air. That in general, plants get bigger, have bigger leaves, and there were some Australian scientists, and they did this test basically with ambrosia plants, and they exposed it to CO2 levels that were like pre-industrial or sort of early industrial, sort of 1890, so that was like 280 parts per million of CO2, and then they exposed it again to levels from the year 2000, which already was more, that was 370 parts per million, and the pollen count increased by 132% in that test. And then they went further and went with the projected CO2 levels for 2050, which are 600 parts per million, and that again resulted in an additional 90% more pollen. So I mean, if looking at that sort of experiment with CO2 levels rising, I mean, that sounded to me like, okay, we're heading for a big problem here.
Ja, also die Zahlen sprechen ja für sich jetzt speziell.
Yes, so those numbers speak for themselves. But I think we should also be asking just how relevant is this increase? Because you can't say that there is a certain threshold of, let's say, 100 pollen per unit for this to have an impact. With ragweed, just a few tiny pollen grains might be enough to trigger an allergic reaction. And the pollen concentration in the air depends on many factors. But for me as a botanist who's been tasked with controlling the ragweed population in this state, the most important thing is to keep a lid on the ragweed population and prevent it from spreading wherever possible.
Die Bestände erfassen und Tipps zu geben oder Hinweise zu geben.
What happens when a species like ambrosia starts to spread and it doesn't have any, natural predators? Is there anything here that eats the ambrosia, or is a natural enemy?
Da gibt es, was Deutschland angeht, meines Wissens noch wenige.
I believe the data on this is very sketchy as far as Germany is concerned. But what is rather new is that I have discovered ragweed plants in the forest whose tops were missing in regular intervals. And this wasn't done by humans. I think that there are wild animals, such as deer or other mammals, that have developed a taste for ragweed.
Die Ambrosia essen.
Is that a good thing then or a bad thing?
Das ist die gute Frage, denn die Pflanze wird dadurch ja nicht.
That's a good question, because it doesn't significantly eradicate the plant. And I'm worried that maybe the seeds could pass through the digestive tract of the animals and spread further throughout the forest. This would be really bad, especially in the Pfälzer Wald, which is a biosphere reserve and a huge recreational area. It's the last place you want ragweed pollen flying around. And since we have such sandy soils there, especially on the forest paths, if the ragweed manages to spread from the wild areas to the sandy forest paths that are not paved, then it will take over in a big way. And once this happens in a forest as large as the Pfälzer Wald, we have little to no chance of containing it.
Natürlich sehr gering und schwer, ja.
If I come across one of these plants in my garden, I mean, what do I do? Do I burn it, or do I just dig it out? I mean, what is the best way to get rid of it and also avoid, contracting an allergy at the same time?
Der erste Schritt ist Da gibt es ja oft Möglichkeiten.
First of all, you need to make sure that it really is ragweed that you found. Then you most certainly need gloves and a face mask. Don't go near them without that. Next, you pull out the plant by the roots, wrap it carefully in a plastic bag, and put it in the garbage. The worst thing you can do is put it on your compost heap. That'll just facilitate the spread of ragweed.
Weil wenn dann Früchte dran sind, dann hat man das Problem oder jemand anderes im nächsten Jahr vielleicht sogar mehrfach.
What is your take? I mean, you're a botanist. What is your take on herbicides? If, for instance, you have a field like this, would it make sense to use chemicals and, just go at it with Roundup? Or, I mean, how do you feel about that?
Also der Herbizideinsatz ist ja grundsätzlich inzwischen
Well, many people are very critical of herbicides, and rightly so.
Manche Mittel sind ja
Allergics might disagree. They might sort of feel, get rid of it as quickly as possible. I'm allergic,
Also man müsste das ja sowieso, da würde ich dem nicht unbedingt...
Herbicides can only be the last resort because of the side effects. Also, herbicides most likely wouldn't solve the problem of the ragweed seeds in the soil. Take this field here. All you need to do is plow it regularly 3 to 4 times a year, and you won't have ragweed growing here like this anymore.
Das Problem ist dann gelöst. Da würden die Leute auch denken, wir haben ja das abgespritzt.
So what are you going to do about this field now?
Also ich habe da schon verschiedentlich die Verwaltung...
Well, I've already written to the local authorities about this, but this land is private, so there's not much they can do about it. In Germany, it's up to the owners to take action. I've also written to them and informed them how problematic ragweed is, but they still haven't done anything about it. It's a shame that not all people are sensitive to just how big an issue this is, especially for people with allergies.
Verständnis halt auch nicht so vorhanden ist. Das ist tatsächlich so, ja.
Well, maybe it'll come when we all start sneezing and developing asthma, then maybe that has to happen for people to take note. Anyway, Johannes Mazomeit, thank you very much for your time. This was Rhineland-Palatinat's chief ambrosia hunter. I can call you that, is that okay? He's laughing. Thank you very much for your time.
Danke.
Okay, so time for my main takeaways from this episode. First off, allergies are not something that just affect allergics. We can all develop them pretty much at any time and any age, and climate change is upping the risk. There even seems to be a connection between high pollen count and the number of COVID cases in certain areas, because, as Professor Traidl-Hoffmann explained, pollen can distract our immune system, leaving it more vulnerable to viruses, for instance. Air pollution is creating more aggressive pollen, and rising CO2 levels are increasing the size of plants and the number of pollen. So, yeah, I mean, the trajectory there is pretty clear. Now, talking about ragweed, just one ragweed plant can produce up to 3 billion pollen grains, and it only takes a few grains to turn you into an allergic. And once you have one allergy, there is, of course, the risk of developing others, so-called cross allergies. So never go near a ragweed during the pollen season without gloves and a face mask. All the experts agree on that. Now, if you have experts like Johannes monitoring the ragweed population, it actually really makes sense to be sure to let them know that if you find any yourself, give them the location, preferably sending also some pics. Citizen science really helps contain this plant and, nip it in the bud, so to speak. Now, what else? Yes, also concerning ragweed, I had no idea that it is mainly spread by us humans and other animals because the seeds are too heavy to be carried far by the wind. The plant itself is rather stationary, so that's good news. The bad news is that the seeds can survive in the earth for decades, so they are really like ticking time bombs, just waiting to explode as soon as they come to the surface. And feeding the birds in your garden is very kind, but you really must make sure you are using products that don't contain ragweed seed. That's my 2 cents for now. If you have anything to add or any questions, please do get in touch. You can send an email to onthegreenfence@dw.com. Many thanks to my colleague and producer Natalie Muller and my sound engineer Gerd Georgi. And as always, a big thanks to you for listening and sharing On the Green Fence. My name is Neil King. Take it easy and take care.